The War of Spanish Succession is a great example of how absolutism in France brought about a large-scale warfare in Europe, and it's certainly a war of expansion. Philip, we talked about how Philip II was a Habsburg king, being the son of Charles V, and from Charles V, or Carlos the First of Spain, Charles the First of Spain, and Philip, we see a Habsburg line in Spain, and that's going to come to an end during the reign of Louis XIV, because Charles II, or Carlos II of Spain, is of old age, and he doesn't have an heir to the throne, and so he actually makes a deal with Louis XIV that he's going to allow Philip of Anjou, who is a grandson of Louis XIV, and a Bourbon, to take the throne upon his death. And this was an agreement that Louis saw as a potential to really unite the powers of France and Spain together. And of course, this freaked the rest of Europe out, and seeing how powerful a Bourbon king could become. I mean, if there were to be a Bourbon king on the throne of France and Spain, and many people interpreted this as, hey, Philip of Anjou is just simply going to be a figurehead for Louis XIV, and you're going to see incredibly just Bourbon powerhouse in Western Europe. And everyone in Europe was against this. In fact, they thought ahead about it. There was a previous treaty that Louis had agreed to with the Holy Roman Emperor, which stated that no Bourbon king could ever ascend or unite with the throne of France and Spain. And so the rest of Europe saw this as a breach of peace, a breach of power. They said, look, this is just Louis being expansionistic again, and we cannot allow this to happen. So the trigger of this was the War of Spanish Succession, named such because of the question of succession to the throne. The rest of Europe responded in the War of Spanish Succession by forming a grand alliance. Major powers, the English, the Dutch, the Habsburgs, Austria, Hohenzollern, Prussia, which we'll get back to talking about Prussia when we get to Eastern absolutism, united in 1700, and from 1701 to 1713 would fight against Bourbon and French expansion. The fighting ended with the Peace of Utrecht. And the agreement, after all the dust settled, and of course everyone's dead, and all the debts are rising in France because of the war. In the end, Philip is able to take the throne, but Philip was forbidden to unite with France. And so we see the end of the Habsburg line in Spain, the beginning of a Bourbon dynasty in France. But Louis kind of gets what he wants, but in the end, it's not really worth the cost he paid for it, because he agrees never to unite Spain and France under one throne, and it doesn't happen. He doesn't really get the payout that he was hoping for, and it costs him a lot. The War of Spanish Succession added greatly to the debt. It creates a lot of discontent within France, and of course creates him a lot of enemies elsewhere. And more than anything else, everyone kind of looks at Louis XIV as the expansionistic monarch that he is, and a threat to peace in Europe. And so out of this, though, comes a concept that's really going to develop throughout the 1700s and really take hold in the 1800s after the Napoleonic era. But there's a sense in international politics in Europe that the way to preserve peace is through a balance of power. That if you've got a powerhouse, they have to be balanced out by other players to prevent a peace from coming into play. And so, authors and writers start talking about this concept, and they certainly see it with Louis, that we need to find a way to prevent him from becoming too powerful, because the more powerful he becomes, the more expansionistic he is, and the more threat there is to peace. That is going to be a driving force concept after Napoleon is removed from power after the French Revolution. So it's something to keep in mind, that the seeds of that are in the Wars of Spanish Succession. All right, let's move here too. And finally, the last thing we're going to talk about in these video lectures is we're going to look at the court culture of absolutism under the Bourbon dynasty in France. One of the things about court culture in absolutism in France is it kind of sets the model for the rest of Europe. So if we look at Mackay from your reading here, Mackay says, for much of the 17th century, the courts of Europe looked to France, and to the Palace of Versailles in particular, for culture as well as political inspiration. art and architecture of Versailles were tools of Louis's policy, used to overcome his subjects and foreign visitors. And the Palace of Versailles initially was a nothing more than a hunting lodge for Louis's father, and he decided to build this up to be this magnificent palace outside of Paris, and be the seed of absolutism, and it would reflect absolutism. It'd be a physical manifestation of his power, and it'd be there to awe, inspire, and to be a place in which the nobles wanted to stay, foreign visitors would come in and be humbled at, and he does just that. It is a massive palace complex in which he adds to for a very long time. So other European monarchs attempted to emulate Versailles. Peter the Great had Peterhof. Frederick the Great created his own version of Versailles, and we're actually going to see other palaces in Austria, Habsburg Austria as well, to try to create this court. The idea of court at Versailles, at the palace, was that Louis decided to use Versailles not only as the center of his power, but he would also require the nobles to be at court. And so he had the nobles. He makes them happy by, of course, not really taxing them at all. But then he says they have to be at court. So they would come to Versailles when they were called to court, and they would literally stay there. And a lot of historians have argued that the court culture of Versailles was designed in such a way that nobles didn't want to leave Versailles. They wanted to be there with the king. They wanted to feel as if he was part of their special circle. At Versailles, nobles would be engaged in hunts. They would be engaged in parties. They would be engaged in all sorts of things in the comforts of this world. And so many nobles always wrote about when they had to go back to their territory, how they desperately wanted to be back up to the court of the Versailles. They wanted to come back. They wanted to be back in the court of the king. The other look at this, though, is the traditional look at this is that what Louis was doing was removing the nobles from their base of power. If they're at Versailles under his watchful eye, they're worried about their parties. They're worried about attending to the king. And literally they attended the king. They had whole waking up ceremonies where the king had to be dressed and all this. That they're not really worried about their land. They're not really worried about their political power. They're more worried about their favor and their standing with the king than they are how much influence they really have. And they're never really too worried about their money, because Louis, for the most part, protects their wealth. He never takes it. He never taxes them. And so in the end, the old traditional view is that he pacifies the nobility, and he makes them compliant in turning over their traditional check on his power to him. Now, some historians have also argued that in reality, and you read this a lot in Mackay, that Louis had to negotiate and his way through the traditional rules of the nobility. And there was some give and takes that he had to make. And there's some truth to that. And we're going to look at the arguments presented in Mackay. But I think in the end, the court of Versailles, in requiring nobles to be at court, and this is all the sword nobility, the robe nobility are out there working for him, really does take them away from their base of power. And they're never able to really, if they wanted to effectively mount any kind of rebellion, they couldn't. But as you can see here, it's an incredible lavish palace. You can see the Hall of Mirrors in the bottom center, one of the famous sites of Versailles. And then you can see its own chapel. And of course, the Versailles itself cost a great deal of money to make and maintain. And so maintaining court and maintaining these nobles and their parties and everything at Versailles actually adds to the debt, the French debt. Not as much as warfare, but quite a bit. And so there's a resentment when we get up to the French Revolution against absolutism as really driving the country into debt. Because keeping in mind, Louis spends money, but he doesn't really fill the coffers of the country's finances. So they spend more than they take in. Not unlike what's happened in recent American history with the last two administrations, both Democrat and Republican, spending quite a bit of money, but still preserving massive tax cuts. So essentially, you're cutting taxes at the same time you're spending more. Well, absolutism was doing that on a much larger scale. And most of the wealth was in the first and second state, and it's completely, for the most part, tax-free, and that greatly reduced to it. So he required these nobles to be at court, to spend part of their living in the attendance at Versailles. And so in any time, this palace complex held between 3,000 and 10,000 people at that site. On top of attending social events, nobles are required to be part of these kind of rituals for the kings. And again, this idea was kind of remove these nobles from the base of their power, and it works. By the time Louis, I mean, I always make the argument, if you got nobles bickering with each other, trying to get in the king's inner circle and fighting over who changes the king's clothes in the morning, you can really say in a way that Louis XIV has real effective control. No one's arguing over what the king's doing, as much as they're worried about their own status within that absolutist system and the absolutist regime. So it's easy to say that when we look at the culture of absolutism, we're going to look at a couple things. When I get back, we're going to examine some art and how art was used. But as McKay says, look, culture was an instrument of the state under absolutism. So we're going to really look at the growth of Baroque art when I get back, how Baroque art and architecture flourished under absolutism, how it was used to glorify the absolutist king, and almost a form of artistic propaganda for the power and the wealth of the rule. Absolutist rulers are going to see is building these lavish palaces such as Versailles. And finally, to centralize authority, absolutist rulers push the development of state languages. And that's going to be a big part of culture as well. We're going to see, like in France, where so many different dialects were spoken, Breton, Anjou, Norman, the list goes on and on. We're going to see like a Parisian dialect really start to be pushed and unified. And that's going to be a process that continues well into the French Revolution and beyond. But we're going to see absolutist rulers seeing a common spoken language as one dialect for their powers, as being part of their control. So we'll be examining Baroque art when I get back, and we'll look at art and architecture, and we'll see how Baroque art flourishes under absolutism. Originally part of the Counter-Reformation, it's going to be certainly adopted in a major part of absolutism in the 1600s.